Hello everybody, and welcome to a new motorcycling video. Today is sorry, I've forgotten the day of the week for a moment. It's Thursday the 1st of September, first day of spring, and I'm just taking the Spyder out for a bit of a ride. People in Goulburn know that the first day of spring doesn't actually mean the first day of warm weather. We don't usually expect to get the warmer weather till the long weekend in October, which is about a month away. But today, as you can see in the video, the sky was reasonably blue. There were a few clouds. It was about 20 degrees, so it was quite comfortable. And I just set off on a ride, but I thought what I would do, rather than just talk about the ride and describe what I'm seeing, or what you're seeing, and I will do that in a moment, but I thought what I would do is talk about some things about the Spyder RT Limited that I don't like. Now, in the earlier video I told you 5 things I liked about it. I couldn't come up with 5 at the moment, but there are a couple of things that I don't really like about it, and I'll talk about those today. Just as an aside, describing where I'm going down Deccan Street for those locally, which is near the new swimming centre, or just past the swimming centre I've just gone past, but it's really nice to see on the bushes and shrubs on the footpaths there, and a bit further down towards Wallandilly Public School, the blossoms on the trees. It certainly is a sign that spring is coming. There's a bit of colour around, and seeing that sort of thing seems to have a bit of an effect of lifting people's spirits a bit, and they generally feel a bit happier and brighter and so on. All right, enough waxing lyrically and philosophically. Let me get into the things that I don't like about the Spyder RT. Now, before I do that, I should acknowledge that mine is a 2012 model, and so some of the things that I will talk about have hopefully been fixed in later editions or later models. They've either been fixed because the engineers and designers have looked and thought that's not a very good way to do that thing, or we can do it a better way, or they've seen the number of repairs to a particular item and thought we need to fix that so we don't have to keep either repairing it under warranty, or owners aren't continually needing to get that part. Now, the first one of these things that I really don't like, and it's just because it's such an irritating and silly thing, is the radio aerial. The radio aerial is a very thin piece of material, and from what I can pick up from other forums and places, it routinely breaks off, and that's exactly what happened with mine. I was going to put a cover on it one day. Now, the original cover that came with the bike, which is a Can-Am cover, doesn't have a hole in it where you can put the aerial through. And so I sort of fiddled around with that to make sure the aerial wasn't getting caught by that cover. But then I have a bigger, heavier cover that I put over that, and it just broke off. Now, it can be replaced, and I've seen a couple of YouTube videos that suggest how you do it. The first one I tried, I couldn't get the right tool for it. I couldn't get the right spanner for it, the right fit for the nut, I guess it is. The second fix was to take off a number of panels, and I undid it. I was reluctant to do that because I don't want to start pulling things apart and then having to put them back together. When you pull panels off, there's always a risk you're going to break a tab or crack a panel or something like that. So I took all the screws off that the video said I should take off, and when the panel didn't come away easily, I just gave up. I should note that the nut that I'm trying to unscrew is brass, so it burrs very easily, and I've tried this, and I'm afraid if I do it try any more, I'm going to ruin it, and then it's not going to be able to come off at all. Now, the thing about that is it doesn't really matter to me that much because I don't listen to the radio. I tend to just plug in my own music player and listen to my own music. But it's the cosmetic look of the bike looking complete and looking like it's supposed to look. There's the issue if I decide at some stage to sell it and say, oh, sorry, the aerial's broken, mate. Somebody wants a discount off the price, and I understand that. But there's the fact that it's just as bad design in the first place. A smaller, shorter, stubbier, more sturdy aerial would have probably done the same job. The one that's on there rises well above the level of the top box, and so it doesn't need to, in my view anyway, I don't know, if I'm not an expert on radios and all that sort of stuff, but in my view it doesn't need to be that big, and if it did need to be that big, it probably should be a telescopic one that goes up and down when you turn the key or something like that to avoid this very problem. Okay, so that's point number one. Now, this is not necessarily in order from the least hateful to the most hateful or something like that. It's just a matter of saying these are things I don't like. Second thing I don't like about this particular model is the fact that the rider gets pegs and the passenger gets adjustable footboards. Now, I'm well aware that lots of people like to customise their own bikes and like to add on things and so on. But as a matter of comfort and a matter of making the riding more comfortable and less fatiguing, I would have thought footboards, especially on the RT Limited, would be a standard feature. Now, I know that you can get footboards that bolt directly over those pegs, and it's just a matter of removing the rubber that's on the peg, I think the rubber pad underneath that absorbs some of the vibration, and then bolting these footboards on. They're not particularly long footboards. You can get much longer ones that allow you to sort of almost go to a highway peg position. But that isn't the point. The point is, I would have thought on the RT Limited, being it's the RT Limited, that the footboards would have come as a standard option. Then there is, of course, the cost of putting on these footboards, which are about $120 American. So to get them sent out here and pay the postage and do the conversion and so on, it's probably going to be more than 120, considerably more than that. So I just would have thought that was something that should have been standard for at least for the limited model. Now, the third thing that I particularly don't like is the fuel gauge, and I'm told by what I don't like about it is that the needle flickers around all the time, and so it's hard to get a reading on exactly how much fuel you've got. Now, I see on a few forums that people say this is a common problem and you just have to learn to live with it. I don't know what the technical reason for that is, whether there's not enough weight on the float in the tank or however these things work, but the needle flickers around all the time, and it's very hard to get a good reading on exactly how much fuel you've got. Now, I'm told that if you disconnect the analog gauge, then the same information will come up in digital format on the information screen in the middle of the dash. And that's well and fine and dandy, but again, you've got to be pulling the bike apart. You've got to undo 3 or 4 screws in the dash, and you've got to get in behind the dash and disconnect this particular gauge. The same applies to the engine temperature gauge, by the way. If you disconnect that, you get a more accurate reading on the digital screen. But again, I'm reluctant to start pulling things apart that I don't know a lot about. I'm reluctant to disconnect things. These things are so computer and electronic reliable that if they come across some part of the bike that's no longer working the way it should, I just wonder whether you're going to get a fault or something like that and end up with stuck somewhere with your bike refusing to start because one simple gauge that doesn't do anything isn't properly connected. Now, the bigger issue with this is to do with working out how much fuel's in the tank. Now, when I picked this bike up, the tank wasn't full to the brim, but then I gather you're not supposed to fill them to the brim because of some petrol smell to do with some other part of the fuel system. However, I rode it from the dealer's place to Marulan, which was a distance about 150 kilometres, and the fuel light started flashing. So I assumed, based on the other bikes that I've owned, that it probably had about 50 kilometres of fuel left, and I'd be able to get home, which I did. But the next day I thought, well, fuel light's flashing, there's not much fuel left, I better go fill it up. So this bike has a 25 litre tank. I go to fill it up. It takes 17 litres of fuel, meaning, of course, there were 8 litres of fuel left in the tank. Now, looking again at some of the American forums and people claiming the mileage, the gas mileage of miles per gallon they get and doing the conversion, I worked out that this bike was giving me about 14 kilometres per litre, or about 7 litres per 100 kilometres. Now, if there were 8 litres left in the tank, I had probably over 100 kilometres more to go. And the point about that is that if you're trying to make a day's ride and you get on your bike and think, well, after 150 kilometres I've got to fill up, or 180 kilometres I've got to fill up. Now, that's probably 2 hours worth of riding and it's probably worth a stop anyway. But if you're not getting an accurate reading of how much is in your tank, you're getting to that range anxiety that people with electric vehicles get, and you start panicking. Am I going to run out of fuel soon? Am I going to run out of fuel? Am I going to make it to the next service station? Or whatever your concern is. And so that's an issue. A bigger issue and a wider issue is that when you look at the screens, what I've come across is the fact that there doesn't appear to be a screen or an information area where you can get a range or distance to empty. there are 2 trip meters, and yes, you can set one and say, well, okay, how far have I gone today? I've gone 180 kilometres, I better start looking for a petrol stop. But it would be better if there was a gauge or an option on the gauge or on the information screen that said distance to empty, and you knew exactly how much fuel you had at the current rate you were riding. Now, by comparison, my Kawasaki Voyager 1700, which is a 2010 model that I bought in 2011, brand new, it had the option of giving you the fuel consumption in kilometres per litre, miles per gallon, or litres per 100 kilometres, whichever way you wanted it. But it also had an option to tell you the distance to empty. It had a very accurate fuel gauge, and I could, at a good ride, get about 300 kilometres from a 20-litre tank, and then still have plenty of fuel left in the tank. My 2009 Suzuki Bergman scooter, whilst it doesn't have a distance to empty, it gives me the kilometres per litre, which is up around 17 kilometres per litre, mostly for city riding, but I expect it would improve a little bit if I was driving in the country on the highways and using the 6-speed overdrive. And when the fuel light starts to flash there, it's a 14-litre tank. It tells me I know that there's about 2 litres, about 12 litres of fuel have been used. There's about 2 litres of fuel left in the tank, and I've probably got about, at a rate of 17 kilometres per litre, I've probably got about 35 kilometres to go before I need to fill up, in which case I'm already looking for the service station. So the point is, the technology was available at that point to be able to give you that distance to empty, and I'm not sure why Can-Am didn't provide it as part of the information screens. But it would have been very helpful. Now, having said all those things and complained about those things, it might just sound like somebody whinging. That's not the case, and even if I'd have known all of those things, it wouldn't have deterred me from buying the machine or riding it, because I had determined that I wanted a 3-wheeler and I wanted something safer, and this was the option that I chose. But it's just things that I would have liked to have. I concede while I'm doing that, as I said, many of these things may have been fixed in later models, but this particular bike is rated at 420 kilos. That's dry. So add on another 25 litres of fuel and you've got another 25 kilos. Add on a few more litres for oil and coolant and so on, and you're probably up at 450 kilos. Now add on to that the 80 kilos of me on top of that, and you're looking at a bike that's well over 500 kilos being hauled around. So I accept that the fuel consumption is not going to be as efficient as the 650 scooter or even the 1700 Bergman, Kawasaki Vulcan, because it's a heavier bike. And I accept also that probably for the last 60 kilometres or so I had my son on the back, so the combined weight of us was probably up around 120, 130, maybe even more, 150 kilos. So there's a fair bit to be hauled around. Can-Am at some stage realised that the 1000 engine wasn't going to be powerful enough or strong enough or good enough for the job they were wanting it to do, and upgraded the engine to the 1330, as I said in an earlier video. And at that time they also upgraded the gearbox to a 6-speed, which means that you essentially have a extra gear for overdrive on the highway cycle, which is going to lead to much better fuel economy. So those things all were improvements that Can-Am either took on board as part of the feedback they were getting from dealers and feedback they were getting from customers and so on, or they just thought, well, it's time for a makeover, and if we're going to do a makeover, let's do a really good one and give this bike a thorough upgrade. So as I said, the issue of the fuel economy probably was improved by adding the bigger engine and the extra gearbox, and I'm hoping that in the newer models with the better access to technology or better programming of the information screens, that you can get a distance to empty reading and not have that range anxiety. Now, having said all of those things, as I said a moment ago, it would not have deterred me from buying the machine. It would not have deterred me from riding it. I still wanted to ride this machine, and I must say, just riding around here in Goulburn as I am at the moment, it's very comfortable to ride, it's very easy to ride, and I'm getting closer and closer to understanding the dynamics of it, especially when you're making turns, and especially right-hand bends and right-hand turns. I did observe in an earlier video that I think turning right is more of a challenge than turning left, and I'm hopefully getting on top of all those things. But as I think I acknowledged in an earlier video again, people say you sometimes need to rack up about 4,000 kilometres before you can say you're proficient or good at riding and understanding how these machines work. Well, I think that pretty well covers the things that I wanted to talk about in this video in terms of the things that I don't like about the machine. They're far outweighed by the things that I do like. And as I said, maybe that's just a case of an old grumpy old bloke having a bit of a whinge. But I think if there are people who are looking at buying this machine, the more research you do and the better warned you are about the machine, the better it is for you. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you've learned something. I'll say goodbye for now, and I'll talk to you when I'm preparing the next video.